Now let us move forward, and I give the floor to Mr. Pavel Kugler from the Czech Republic. He works in the archive, and if we translate the title of the archive, it is difficult to understand it. Is it a state security archive? And after his studies, Mr. Kugler is engaged in political parties activity throughout the democratic activity from 1945 to 1999. His presentation is on the persecution of the Catholic Church in the Czechoslovakia in the period between 1953 and 1968. Mr. Kugler, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to inform you about the persecution of the Roman Catholic Church in the Czechoslovakia during the period 1953 to 1968. If we summarize the development of the Communist Party stance toward the Roman Catholic Church and often towards the Church and religion in general, and the form and content of state security policy, there is no doubt that it can be characterized as a strange mix of pragmatism and ideological blinkers, which generally prevailed. The dominance of the ideological perspectives that pertained in all other eras of life in post-1948 Czechoslovakia made it impossible for any kind of reasonable agreement to be reached between the communist-controlled state and the Church. Even though such a modus vivendi could have been beneficial to both sides, not just to the Church. While it may have appeared in the first 3 years after the war that the conciliatory coexistence of the Catholic Church and communist adherents of Marxist materialism was not impossible, the communists soon destroyed that illusion after they had grabbed complete power. Most measures against the Church were implemented in the period when the new system was being established. That was 1949 to 1951. Among the hostile steps taken against the Church were an effort to split it using collaborationist groups, Patriots movement, merging to the Greek Orthodox Church with the Orthodox Church, land reform, dissolution of both men's and women's orders, the breaking of all relation with the Vatican, church trials, interment of the church hierarchy, and anti-church legislation. Thanks to its compact configuration, the Catholic Church proved a fundamental problem to the communist regime. The communists preferred exercising power to political negotiation, as seen in approval of a church law in October 1949 that brought churches under the state control. In line with this is what was referred to as the Catholic action, a policy in support of progressive Catholics that were to distance themselves from the Vatican. However, that ended in fiasco. Among those who took part actively were people whose loyalty to the communists became fully apparent later with the foundation of the peace movement of the Catholic ministry in 1951. The existence of that organization was one of the many reasons that relations between the Czechoslovak Republic and the Vatican became an impossibility for a whole decade. In the first wave of persecution, the communist leadership planned to cripple the Church and virtually exclude it from social life, which to a large degree it succeeded in doing. However, one area in which the regime did not achieve the expected success was in winning the support of church members. Even after grabbing control of the country and making use of all the means at their disposal, the communists were unable to ignore the potential threat posed by the church. Despite Czech society being regarded as among the most secular in the world, and the fact that the country has a thorny relationship with the Vatican, in the 1950s, the 76% of the population still declared themselves to be Roman Catholic. This feature points to the fact that there was a considerable percentage of Christians among the Communist Party voters. The milestone of the year 1953, the death of Stalin and in the Czechoslovakia Klement Gottwald, is an illusory one, because the process began in previous years carried on. From 1952, a campaign had been launched with the aim of snuffing out religion throughout the country and building an atheistic society. A general change in church policy was seen a switch from declared efforts to involve the church and its members in the joint building of socialism to a more open formulation of the position that there would be no place for them in that future society. Religion was driven out of the education system, while it was made clear that membership of both party and faith group was incompatible. However, a plan drawn up in March 1953 with the intention of disbanding female orders and congregations in July of that year was in the end shelved indefinitely. Revolts in Germany and Hungary played an important role in that decision by senior party organs, as did the relatively unsettled situation in Czechoslovakia resulting from monetary reform. While certain changes for the better can be observed from 1953, they were in most cases merely cosmetic. Examples were an end to the capricious transfer and pensioning of all priests by church secretaries and a reduction in arbitrariness with regards to granting of permission for church ceremonies. The most important changes in that period include the abolition of PTP units, this is the abbreviation for military forced labor camps, and the closure of internment and war camps from 1953 to 1956, from which the majority of monks and priests held against their will were freed. A short ideological thaw around the year 1956 didn't bring practical changes, as while penal repression did ease, it didn't cease. Church members sentenced in show trials remained behind bars and bishop seats remained unfilled. The relative liberalization which followed the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and events in Poland and Hungary didn't greatly affect Czechoslovakia. On the basis of information available, it can be observed that the number imprisoned at the beginning of the 60s was very similar to the feature from the first wave of church repressions. The extent of that persecution goes some way to dispelling the theory that the anti-church terror was confined to the early to the early 50s. Nonetheless, in July 1956, the political bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party tasked the Minister of Justice with cooperating with the Ministers of the Interior and Education and Culture to examine all 384 cases involving priests in jail in that time. Further proof that persecution was ongoing was the fact that trials of members of religious orders took place in the second half of the 50s and the early 60s. What did differ from the early phase, however, was the typology of these proceedings. Instead of trials of individuals from single orders, there were trials of a larger group of monks from one order to congregation. The aim of such horizontally conduct trials or other groups trials of monks from one order was not merely to get rid of leadership figures, but to put monasteries from out of action. Generally speaking, the label anti-church trial is also problematic because the term implies a policy towards the church hierarchy, while from the mid-50s, the communists made it abundantly clear that what they were engaged it was a fight against their religious co-citizens. It became apparent that the party efforts to control the church through internal fragmentation had failed. Expectation of internal strains between the hierarchy and the clerics were not borne out, while collaborationist organizations like the peace movement of the Catholic ministry found very little support among the laity. Despite the communists having possession of all media influence, supported by organs of repression, they didn't succeed in detaching the Catholic Church from Vatican and creating so-called national church. Among the notable changes implemented by the state in 1956 was the dissolution of the State Office for Church Affairs and the transfer of its power to the Ministry of Education and the shelving of campaign to enroll children into the church. Calls for an end to repressive steps against the clergy led only to decrease in the number of cases and slight reduction in the sentences of some imprisoned priests. The Central Committee refused to countenance either the release of priests, as happened in Poland and Hungary, or a review of their trials. The most common reason for imprisonment were, according to the period classification, the crimes of treason, espionage, endangering state secrets, subversion, incitement, spreading alarm, failure to report a crime, association against the state, and obstruction of state governance of the church. Alongside proceedings against priests, there were increasing number of show trials of members of the Catholic laity, intellectuals, writers, members of Orel. Orel was a Christian sport organization, the Scouts, etc. State employees didn't escape the pressure and very repeatedly instructed to quit the church. The later half of the 50s is characterized by a drive to force religious education out of schools. Teachers with a Christian worldwide worldview were discriminated against, while schools at which there was a huge decline in interest in religious education were highlighted. Religious education was still part of school curricula in Czechoslovakia, until 1952, but the regime quickly changed that. By the middle of the 50s, less than one half of school pupils attended religious education classes. In between the 1955 to 56, the percentage was 43%. Between the end of the 50s and the end of the 70s, the percentage of children who officially studied religious education fell by approximately 8, with only 5% still attending religious education lessons at the end of the 70s. In some districts, such as border areas and in the central Bohemia region, religious education disappeared completely. In the biggest cities in the Bohemia and Moravia, meanwhile, around 8 to 10% of all school pupils went to religious education classes. As a result of persecution, attendance numbers at religious services declined continuously. Meanwhile, the secularization of social life intensified. Efforts aimed at forcing the church to remain behind the doors of church buildings continued. Traditional processions and pilgrims disappeared, and the church was limited to social and charity work. Repression deepened further with the approval of new constitution in 1960, intended to reflect the successful culmination of socialism in Czechoslovakia. The word church didn't appear in all, and there was no mention of relations between the state and churches or religious associations. The documents limited itself to asserting the religious freedom of the individual. Article 2, paragraph 32, the part 1 states, freedom of religions is guaranteed. Okay. However, in Article 1, paragraph 18, the part 1, it states that the culture policy of Czechoslovakia's education and school system is built on the fundamentals of Marxism and Leninism, closely linked to the life of the working class. This practically precluded religious freedom because Christian citizens were not allowed to contravene the state's atheistic line. The 1960s saw a deepening of the discord in the relationship between the ruling party and religion. Practically nothing changed in the position of the Communist Party and representatives of state's governance. They warned Roman Catholic priests and lay people against activism and against growing attendance at services. Their work was to be primarily focused on young people and to exclude any form of religious life. The massive wave of arrests of priests that took place in the first third of the 60s gives the lie to the myth of the moderation of socialist rule in Czechoslovakia and the wonderful 60s in Czechoslovakia. The last of those imprisoned for their beliefs were not freed until 1967 to 1968. The state's new church policy represented the first reforms connected with the Prague Spring. Thank you very much for your attention.